Morning, church. It's a pleasure to be standing here in front of you today. Since the last time I was here, a lot's changed. We've welcomed a new member into our family. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everyone for your kind words, your gifts, your visits, and most importantly, your prayers. So today, as we look at our theme, which the worship today is hoping to help us to lead ourselves into a new sense of connectedness with one another, and also a new generosity in sharing the grace and mercy of God. When I think of things like this, oftentimes I think of journeys in life, and oftentimes I think the most important journey, obviously, is where our soul is going. But when I think about some of the journeys in my life, there's one that comes up and is a journey in the history of where I'm from. So British Caribbeans migrated to the UK after the First and Second World Wars in what was called a Windrush migration aboard this ship called the Empire Windrush. So after the two world wars, Britain was decimated by Nazi Germany, and they needed to invite people to come to help to rebuild the country. So that invite went out around the British Empire at the time, and there were a certain group of people who were ready and prepared to respond to that invite. And these people were like my great-grandparents of that generation 80, 90 years ago. And they were ready, they were prepared, and they migrated to the UK in a sense of togetherness. But when I think about my own life, or even the life of my parents and my grandparents, I can describe it as what I'd call itinerant. An itinerant life means a life where you are on a journey, going from place to place. And this strikes home as a Christian, because as we look at the life of Jesus Christ, it was also an itinerant life. Jesus was an itinerant teacher, going from town to town, city to city, village to village. Also looking at Paul's missions and the missionaries in the world today. So as we go through today's topic, I want us all to reflect on our own journeys, where we are, where we've been, and where we hope to go. And what's the state of our faith? What's the state of our spiritual walk? And as we think about bringing this into a context of being together, of a sense of oneness of fellowship, and also a sense of liberal generosity, let us think how we can strive to be better in that regard. So today's message is taken from the book of Luke. So this is a book we've been looking at for the last few months. And just to provide some context, we looked at the first couple of chapters, which introduced the parallel births of Jesus, the Messianic King, and John, the prophetic messenger. And we also, from chapters 3 to 9, looked at the genealogy of Jesus Christ and how that goes back and how it was carefully planned and executed as part of God's divine plan. And we also looked at Jesus' baptism, his baptism by John the Baptist, and the start of his ministry. And that ministry was Jesus launching a mission to bring good news to the poor, to the downtrodden, to the marginalized in society. And that mission continues today as part of the church's mission. And then throughout the rest of Luke, Jesus' journey between chapters 9 and 19, that long journey to Jerusalem, the city on the hill where he eventually arrives. But for today, we're going to spend time in Luke chapter 12. So in Luke chapter 12, the theme of fear, Luke speaks a lot about fear. There was a lot of reasons for the audience to be in fear at that time. What type of fear, you might ask? There would have been fear of death, fear of public disapproval because of having the lack of words to defend yourselves in times of persecution. And there would also have been the fear of sustenance, providing for your daily needs. If you were to be as generous and liberal in your giving, that might bring a certain sense of fear about what about me and my needs and who's going to look after me. But the message in Luke is an encouraging one because Jesus exhorts us to overcome these fears. And as Christians, we're called to have that courage and the boldness to go boldly in the face of fear and to leave our comfort zone. And we do this by focusing on his tenderness and also the grace and generosity of Jesus Christ. So there's a clear exhortation here to not fear those who kill the body. But what we are to do is to acknowledge Christ before men so that we are not denied before angels. And that's the journey that we're on each and every day in this world. So thanks to Brother Simon last week, who set a really good context for today's message, going through the parable of the rich fool. So the parable of the rich fool encouraged us to guard ourselves against covetousness, guard ourselves against having a getting mindset, desiring of things and storing up in abundance, accumulating wealth on this earth. What it encouraged us to do was to not seek possession, but to seek the kingdom first. And as we ground this message as a message of generosity and togetherness, we're doing these things because we are seeking the kingdom first and not seeking things that will make us comfortable first. So do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will wear. Consider the ravens and the lilies of the field. Are they not provided for? What about us if they are provided for? So let's seek the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. So that's the context where we move into Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 40. So there's this concept of eschatology, and eschatology seeks to explain what's the destination, what's the final destination of a human's soul. Why were we created and where we're going? Every human being asks this question. And the Bible gives us this perfectly unified upper and lower story, which leads us to this new garden through Jesus Christ. And that's what we're exploring in our adult Bible class series at the moment. It essentially explains the final destiny of our soul. It explains the journey that we're on from the Garden of Eden, banishment, to the story of redemption and restoration into the new garden. So while we're on that journey, we need to go on that journey together. We need to go on that journey in a spirit of openness and liberal generosity. And there's one other thing. God wants us all to live in a perfect, loving community with unified fellowship. In the last adult Bible class series, we learned about the Al-Anon community, which are a group of Christians who sold all they had, and they pulled together, they bought this house, they opened the doors to the community. They opened the doors to the most downtrodden, marginalized, the less privileged in society, because they didn't want to spend their life focused on their own comforts, their own possessions and material things. They wanted to dedicate that all to the community. So I think we're called as the church to provide the same glimpse into the kingdom. That's our role as those outside these walls and outside this worship hall see us as we depart from these buildings. Do they see a glimpse into the kingdom? Do they see that through self-sacrifice? Do they see that through generosity? And do they see that through unified fellowship that's so deep it goes beyond the surface, where we have all things in common? So as we go into the text, Luke chapter 12, verse 32 reads, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So I think this is an encouragement to share in the DNA of Christ, to share in the characteristics of our Father, Shepherd, and King, through not being afraid, through realizing that we are in his flock. And he's asked us to be liberal. He's asked us to be generous in our giving. So as we think about our possessions, I think a good analogy as to how we are to approach our possessions. I don't know if you've ever held a butterfly in your hand. And you think about, if you had the opportunity to hold a butterfly, how would you hold it? Would you hold it very tight and put it in your back pocket? Would you sit on top of it to protect it because you didn't want to lose it? No, you'd hold it very loosely. And I think as Christians, we're called to have that same approach to our possessions today. Hold them, yes, but hold them loosely. And as we hold them loosely, I think that liberates us from the fear. And I think the fear we're talking about here when Luke says, "Fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." The fear we're talking about here is the fear of being so generous that you might not have enough for yourself. A fear that removes your trust in the provision of God, that if you give, He will look after you even as he looks after the ravens and the lilies in the field. So possessions aren't bad things, and this is not a sermon about how bad possessions are. Possessions are there to be stewarded, but if we're not careful, possessions burden us. They slow down our ministry. And oftentimes we need to really think about our approach to how we are stewarding those resources, which in themselves are a gift from God, which we are to hold carefully. So I think this message today is really one of warning against covetousness and seeking to acquire things like the rich fool. The rich fool in Luke chapter 12 had many things, was very rich. He had to build a bigger new barn, or in today's terms, open a bigger bank account. But he was rich in things and poor to God. So let us avoid falling into that same trap. I can think of stories from my childhood where I just always wanted the latest video games. The newest video game I had to have, the latest PlayStation, Xbox, I just had to have it. And it captivated me as a child. And I'm sure there's things that we all like and things that we all want, but we need to be very careful as we grow and as we mature to learn that things are to be used and not loved. And then as we look at examples in the book of Acts, as we read in Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 2, verse 45, it tells us that Christians were actually practicing these things. Christians were selling their possessions, distributing to those who had needs. Christians were having all things in common, true fellowship. These things were actually done by the early Christians. So let us aspire to replicate that in today and realize what that could look like for me, with my unique talents, my unique gifts, my unique resources, the time I have. How am I going to use that, and how am I going to be generous in that and trust God as I give? Jesus spoke about money a lot. It's one of the most popular topics in the Bible. He spoke about it more than he spoke about intimate relationships, worship, family, because that was a big temptation at the time of writing, just as it's a big temptation for us today. So money is to be stewarded so that we can create that vertical relationship between our resources and heaven. And as we just did a few minutes ago, as we worship God through our money, through our giving, and through our generosity, it just goes to show how important it is. Whether it's a widow's mite or a millionaire's thousand, when we're giving and when we're using money to worship God, are we demonstrating our trust in his provision? Are we saying to him, we're fighting accumulation because we want to lay up treasures for ourselves in heaven? Are we saying to him, my heart belongs to you, Father, not money, and this is the meaning of my worship as I give? In the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most potent sermons in the Bible, and one which we spent a lot of time on this year, in Matthew 6, verses 19 to 20, it tells us to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, not on the earth. And what the Sermon on the Mount essentially encourages us to do is to divest of our earthly treasures and invest in eternal treasures, treasures that won't be subject to inflation eating away at your pension, or recessions threatening your jobs, or products that get old and obsolete which you need to replace, or market crashes. We are to store up for ourselves things in heaven where moths don't break in or where rust doesn't attack. So we lay down the baggage that these things bring, and as Christians we engage in a life of minimalism. We can look at John the Baptist as a good example of someone who engaged in a life of minimalism and who was mission focused. So too for us as Christians, we need to be on guard against that. Because where our treasure is, brethren, that's where our heart is also. So our lifestyle should be an act of faith. Our lifestyle is a form of worship and belief in God as our providers. And what does that look like? What does the generosity what type of generosity would that encourage us to partake in? Because generosity is one thing that shows that we truly trust God. Good, authentic generosity. The ministry of giving in secret, giving and not letting your left hand know what your right hand's doing as you submit yourself to the ministry and mission of the church and God. So The encouragement here today is to use things and love people, to be countercultural and not use people and love things. So let's avoid hoarding, accumulation, and learn the lessons from the parable of the rich fool, and steward well. And stewarding is very unique to each one of us because we're all unique. We've all been bestowed with our own unique gifts, but we have to give it thought and we have to evaluate our lives and see what that looks like for us. So let's not be people who are afraid, right? If we trust in God, we trust in his provisions, we trust in his grace and his mercy, we have his example of his life, his mission, his ministry, let us be bold. Let us be courageous in that. And let us be liberally generous to all whom we come across. Because this is our way to demonstrate that we share in the DNA of Christ. To demonstrate that we are his flock. We are his children and we are his royal subjects. So in this text, Jesus has 3 designations. So it says to us, fear not, little flock. So firstly, it shows us that Jesus is our good shepherd. And he is a good shepherd indeed. If you read John chapter 10, verses 11 to 16, it says, John 10, 11 to 16, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Jesus Christ is not a hired hand. He is a good shepherd that will lay down his life for us. The Lord is indeed my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me by the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Jesus Christ restoreth our soul and leads us in the path of righteousness. So we have to understand the nature of shepherding and the shepherd that we have, and that we are children of a good and gracious Father, a generous Father, a caring Father, a Father who will not allow anything to happen to us, a Father who's going to guard us if we trust him, if we live with love under his authority. And not only is he our shepherd and our Father, he's also our King. So our Father is the King, which makes us heir to the throne. We are royal children of a great and loving King. So this means that we will live in the palace as children of the King, if we're ready and if we're prepared at his return. We will enjoy the fruits of being the child of a king. We won't pay taxes, so to speak. We won't do manual labor outside the palace. We will be inside at the banquet table where he comes to serve us at that great banquet at the return. So I think it's important to understand this dynamic and important to understand the nature of Christ as he commands us to be generous people, to be connected and unified in fellowship. And as we move across to the second half of the text for today, verse 35 reads, stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning. So this is telling us to be ready, to be on guard, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast. Have you ever been somewhere, maybe when you were a child, your parents left and they were going to come back and you didn't quite know when you would wait on guard? Or your boss is gone and he's on his way back and you didn't quite know when you would be on guard. Right here, this is telling us as Christians, we do not know when the master's going to come back, but he will come back from the feast so that they may open the door to him once he comes and knocks. So we need to be ready for that knock. Blessed are those whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and recline at the table. So this is very countercultural in an upside-down kingdom. The master will return, and the master will dress himself to serve the servants. And he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. So the encouragement here for us is to be these blessed servants who he finds awake, who he finds standing by the door ready to open as soon as we hear the knock, because there cannot be a delay. But know this, if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. So this is really an exhortation to preparation, because in Jesus' teaching of grace and mercy, it was always set in the context of a coming judgment. And this isn't something that should cause panic or fear. This is something we joyfully look forward to as a blessing. So we need to be prepared. And this preparation manifests itself in being dressed for action, being ready, being equipped with the tools that we need to be successful. So as we read Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, this gives us the illustration of the armor of God. And this armor of God paints a picture of what it looks like to be dressed, to be ready to serve in that kingdom. So we need to have the belt of truth. We know the gospel is truth. The gospel is powerful. We have that around our waist. We have the breastplate of righteousness. We know our shepherd leads us in the path of righteousness. The gospel of peace, which is truly good news and truly transformative when internalized. The shield of faith, behind which we put everything behind our faith. The helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which we need for every step of this journey that we're on. So the encouragement here is to be dressed for action, to be ready. But let's also be busy. Be busy in the field, busy in ministry. And as we think about our ministry, everything with ministry starts with the Spirit and the heart. The Spirit cultivating the heart, which will lead us to minister in a way that is sacrificial, a way that's loving, a way that's generous, kind, and connected. We minister together. But it all starts with the heart by exposing ourselves to solid food, to true solid food, which builds our faith and builds our spiritual lives. And then as we look outside of ourselves into our marriages, are we being biblical husbands? Are we husbands who are leading in the home and encouraging our wives and shepherding our wives? Are our wives being biblical wives as well, as per the instructions in the Bible? And then as children enter the equation, are we ministering as biblical parents and our children being raised in the biblical way? Because this is what society needs. This is how the church impacts the culture and avoids the culture impacting the church. So this is something we have to protect as a church, and we have to encourage and ensure that we're ministering in all these different areas, so that when we go outside the home, outside the church, into the community or into our extended family, this is the grounding with which we spring forward out into the world with the Great Commission. And as we go even further, looking at our city, looking at our country, and looking at distant lands, we need to be busy in each of these spheres of influence in our lives as we wait for that return. So the promise is great, brethren. The master will serve those who are ready on his arrival, and it's in an upside-down countercultural kingdom. And this is gospel. This is good news. And this is something that we can build our lives on. So as we know that the hour and the day is unknown, we have to be alert. We have to use peripheral vision. So that means you look down the middle of the room and you can see the entire room. Because sin is like a landmine. And if you're not walking with your eyes open, you will step on landmines. And that's something that endeared people to someone like Princess Diana, who spent a lot of her life going to places where there were landmines, because you saw the destruction landmines cause. And I think landmines are a really good analogy for sin. You step on a landmine, you could lose your leg, you could lose an arm, you could lose everything. And I think sin is exactly the same way. So we need to use our peripheral vision as Christians to be alert. And if we're busy in ministry, if we're prepared, if we're awake, that vision will help to keep us on the right path. But as we do that, we can't do that alone. We need to have that unified, perfect fellowship that the Bible speaks about, Christians having all things in common, like in Acts chapter 4, and how those Christians lived together, walked together from day to day, shared all things, had all things in common, sold as anyone had need. That's what fellowship looks like. So this is an encouragement for us to continue to strive towards that definition and that standard of fellowship and the generosity that will inevitably come off the back of that. So The final words of encouragement here is for us to all live as if the kingdom is about to break into the world at any moment. What does that mean? What does that look like if we're truly living as if the kingdom's about to break into the world? Not because we're afraid, but because of the blessings and joy that brings. That's the encouragement for us today. So, fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. It is your Father's good pleasure to liberally, to generously give you the kingdom. We don't serve a tight-fisted God. We don't serve a God who would hold that butterfly and squash it because he doesn't want it to fly away. We serve a God who would hold things loosely, would be loving with resources, and it is his good pleasure to give us the kingdom. So we have no reason to fear if we're doing these things, because this generosity reflects that true character. And also, if we can do it, then we're showing that we share in Christ's DNA. So the preparation is not one we can take for granted. It is urgent. It's an urgent preparation. We do need to be ready. We do need to be awake. And we think about the parable of the foolish virgins. There were 10 virgins. Some had prepared enough oil when the bridegroom returned back and they had the lamps. Some didn't. Let us be like those wise virgins who put the necessary precautions in place and had enough oil and prepared for this with the Spirit and with the humility that's required to do that. So this is a sincere and open invitation to respond to this message. If we feel you're a Christian and generosity is something you can work on, fear-free generosity where we truly trust God is something you can work on, or the connectedness of us as a body, the perfect unified fellowship of knowing the person who you sit shoulder to shoulder with and understanding what their concerns are, understanding where they need prayer, understanding the trials they've overcome in their lives. This is an open, sincere invitation to, you could come forward, you could ask for a prayer, you could speak to someone and ask someone to pray for you. But we do need prayer, and this is the reason for fellowship, is to come forward and expose the areas which we have struggles. Or perhaps you're not a Christian, but you've heard the gospel. You've heard the gospel preached to you. You know Jesus Christ came, he died, he was buried, he rose again, and you believe that. Preparation is urgent because we do not know when he would come back. But you need to be prepared to confess of your sins, to be baptized, and to repent and join this flock and to continue to grow on that journey that we're all on together. So the elders will be at the front and we'll be leading a song of invitation. Please stand as we sing.